October 2023. Fort Worth, Texas. An emergency dispatcher receives a distress call. On the other end of the line is a man in genuine panic. His voice is breaking. He's crying, and he's begging for help to be sent immediately. He claims that his girlfriend has just been fatally injured by their own family dog. Police officers and paramedics are dispatched to the scene. Before we walk into that apartment alongside investigators, let me make a quick detour. I always look for real, documented cases for you. Cases backed by official records, where the raw facts are far more shocking than anything fiction could come up with. If you appreciate that approach, consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription, so you don't miss future stories. Thanks. Now, let's get back to the investigation. When officers enter the apartment, they find Sheila Cuevas unresponsive on the floor. Animal control follows its standard protocol and takes custody of the dog, a pet named Soldier. Not long afterward, the dog is euthanized after being officially classified as a dangerous animal responsible for a fatal incident. The apartment's owner appears completely devastated. He's overwhelmed with grief and can barely keep himself together. At first glance, everything looks like a horrific accident. But Detective Tracy Dixon isn't ready to jump to conclusions. She studies the layout of the room, the placement of objects, and the overall scene. Then she notices something troubling. This doesn't look like the aftermath of a chaotic animal attack at all. Instead, it resembles a carefully arranged, cold, and deliberate stage set. That raises an obvious question. Why would someone want to place the blame on the dog? And why was this crying man so confident that law enforcement would accept the story without question and believe his seemingly perfect alibi? To understand who this grief-stricken boyfriend really was, we need to rewind the clock and step outside that Texas apartment. Meet 34-year-old Caleb Mickens. Online, he was better known by a far more prestigious alias, Cash Cartier. Nearly 100,000 followers watched him every day as he presented himself as a cryptocurrency investing expert, business mentor, and financial influencer who had supposedly mastered the system. His primary source of income was a training platform called I Am Academy. At the height of his online activity, Caleb was reportedly bringing in around $20,000 a week. The business model was remarkably cynical. He earned a direct commission for every new person he could recruit into the organization. Years later, regulators would accuse the platform of operating through pyramid-style structures and impose massive financial penalties. But at that time, Caleb was sitting at the top of the hierarchy. He sold his audience a carefully crafted illusion of success, posting videos about overcoming hardship and building wealth from nothing. People believed him. They purchased subscriptions and trusted him with money they could barely afford to lose. But if we put down the smartphone and pull police records from California dating back to 2011, we find a very different story. In the actual court documents, there is no mention of a successful trading career. Instead, there is a documented fact: an arrest and a prison sentence for causing severe bodily injury. After serving his sentence and returning to the outside world, he learned one important lesson. Street crime was a direct ticket back to a prison cell. So he completely changed his methods. His natural aggression, his need for total control, and his desire to dominate other people were carefully repackaged into the image of a confident online business mentor. The internet became his new weapon. Caleb mastered the art of manipulating large audiences from a safe distance. He built an almost untouchable image of wealth, credibility, and success around himself. One thing I keep noticing in cases like this is a disturbing pattern. The new generation of criminals doesn't hide in dark alleys anymore. They buy a ring light, set up a camera, and show up directly on our phones. For years, this carefully engineered system of deception worked almost flawlessly. And it wasn't just inexperienced followers who got caught in the trap. Before long, Caleb began using the exact same persuasion techniques on women who believed the polished digital persona he presented to the world. His smartphone screen became the perfect training ground for the controlling behavior that would later spill into his personal relationships. And that's exactly how Sheila became entangled in the web he had spent years building. She was the complete opposite of the typical audience targeted by online financial influencers. Sheila graduated from college with honors, built a stable and practical career, and had accumulated substantial personal savings. She had a clear vision for her future and strong support from a loving family. Caleb applied the same proven persuasion strategy to her with remarkable precision, presenting himself as a respected expert who showcased success to thousands of followers every day. He repeatedly encouraged Sheila to invest her money into his ventures. His arguments sounded convincing, confident, difficult to challenge. Eventually, Sheila trusted him and transferred her assets. Within a surprisingly short period of time, those savings disappeared into a network of financial arrangements that offered very little transparency. And that's when we see the first major shift in Caleb's behavior. At the same time, the carefully constructed empire he had built online was beginning to face serious problems. Regulatory agencies started taking a closer look at IM Academy, and the flow of new recruits slowed dramatically. The steady stream of easy money that had fueled his lifestyle for years began to shrink. He hadn't lost everything yet. Online, the image of a successful entrepreneur was still intact. The social media posts were still there. The appearance of success remained. But for the first time, cracks were starting to show. And with those cracks came anxiety. Feeling his status and income under threat, Caleb experienced a major blow to his inflated sense of self-worth. All of that growing frustration quickly became focused on the one person who happened to be living with him. This is where a classic criminal pattern begins to emerge. A lot of people assume controlling relationships start with shouting, obvious confrontations, or visible acts of aggression. In reality, the strongest prisons are often built from emptied bank accounts. Caleb began systematically cutting Sheila off from her relatives and close friends. Any attempt she made to maintain outside contact was quickly shut down, and in its place, he pushed his own distorted version of reality. He monitored where she went, kept track of when she returned home, and turned everyday life into a system of constant check-ins and accountability. The man who had once influenced thousands of people through a screen had now narrowed his need for control down to a single apartment. At that point, Sheila could no longer simply pack a suitcase, call a cab, and return to her family. The reality was much simpler than that. She no longer had enough money of her own to buy a plane ticket or even pay for a hotel room for a few days. Her financial safety net had been wiped out, and her outside support system had been deliberately dismantled. The perfect closed environment for escalating physical intimidation had now been fully established. As the isolation continued to grow, Sheila's smartphone became her only remaining connection to the outside world. And then, unexpectedly, a powerful warning appeared. It arrived through a private Instagram message. The sender was a woman named Carrie, living thousands of miles away from Texas and Scotland. She wasn't a random critic. She wasn't another disappointed customer from one of Caleb's financial programs. Carrie was his former wife. Years earlier, she had believed the same story about the perfect man. She left her home in Europe and crossed the Atlantic to build a life with him. The message she sent wasn't emotional ranting. It wasn't filled with insults. Wasn't driven by jealousy. What Sheila received was something much more unsettling. It read like a survival guide. Carrie directly warned her about the person she was actually living with. She explained details about his extensive legal history and his pattern of aggressive behavior. Step by step, she described the cycle she had experienced herself. First, he isolates you from the people around you. Then, he gradually takes away your independence. And after that, the intimidation becomes increasingly severe. The message ended with one simple plea: leave now, while you still have the ability to walk away on your own. Let me ask you something honestly. Take a second before answering. What would you do if you received a warning that detailed from someone who had already lived through the exact same situation? Most of us would probably pack our belongings and head for the door immediately. But that's not what happened. The message from Scotland went unanswered. Sheila didn't contact law enforcement. She didn't reach out to her family. The explanation for what seems like an impossible decision lies in the mechanics of control itself. By this point, Caleb hadn't just taken her money. He had gained access to passwords, private accounts, and nearly every personal boundary she had left. He personally monitored incoming calls. He read messages. He positioned himself as the gatekeeper of information, deciding what she was allowed to see, hear, and believe. Over time, Caleb systematically convinced Sheila that Carrie was emotionally unstable and driven by deep resentment toward their relationship. Any attempt from the outside world to tell her the truth was immediately turned upside down. He was remarkably skilled at presenting himself as the innocent target of false accusations, insisting that his bitter ex-wife was simply trying to destroy the happiness he had found with someone new. Day after day, little by little, that psychological conditioning began to take effect. Warnings from outsiders no longer felt like warnings. The information blockade worked exactly as intended. It burned the last remaining bridge to the outside world and sealed the trap shut. Then, in the spring of 2023, after realizing that private warnings weren't making any difference, Carrie completely changed her approach. The situation moved out of direct messages and into the public eye. She published everything she had collected on her social media pages. And these weren't vague accusations or emotional statements. She released documented evidence, photographs of documented injuries, screenshots containing direct threats, detailed accounts explaining the methods of control and intimidation she said she had experienced. The impact was immediate. What happened next set off a powerful chain reaction. Within just a few days, 12 more women decided to come forward with stories of their own. Among them were Darian and Ashley. What makes this especially significant is that these women lived in different cities and, in many cases, had never even met one another. Yet their accounts followed the exact same pattern. Their statements matched down to the smallest details. First came control over personal finances, then isolation from friends and family, and finally, increasingly severe physical intimidation behind closed doors. Take a moment to look at the scale of what was unfolding. More than a dozen independent witnesses were now publicly describing what they claimed were repeated incidents of aggression. At that point, an obvious question emerges. How does someone with such an extensive trail of documented allegations remain free, continue living comfortably, and avoid sitting in a jail cell awaiting trial? The answer can be found in court records from Dallas County. Before this wave of public attention ever began, the Texas legal system had already had Caleb in custody. One of the women who later spoke publicly, Darian, had managed to leave the relationship, document her injuries, and initiate a formal investigation. According to court records, investigators gathered enough evidence to move forward. Law enforcement followed standard procedure. Caleb was arrested on charges connected to domestic aggression, and the case was placed before a judge. But inside the courtroom, something happened that would eventually contribute to devastating consequences. A carefully prepared support group arrived on behalf of the defendant. Friends, associates, business partners. One after another, they testified under oath and presented glowing character references. Defense witnesses described him as an exceptionally respectable man, a generous mentor, and a successful entrepreneur who had supposedly made mistakes while dealing with intense personal stress. For the court, those statements painted a very different picture from the one being described by the women who had come forward. The court accepted those statements at face value. The judge declined to send the aggressor to prison. Instead, Caleb received probation and was ordered to complete standard anger management classes. For a case involving documented physical aggression, the outcome was remarkably lenient. Legally, he was classified as someone who did not pose a significant threat to the public. He was released under supervision and allowed to walk out of the courtroom. That decision would later become a critical turning point in the entire case. After avoiding serious consequences for behavior that had already been proven in court, Caleb walked away with something even more dangerous than freedom. He walked away believing he was untouchable. The justice system had failed at a crucial moment. A man with a documented history of aggressive behavior was released back into society, and the very safeguards that were supposed to protect future victims simply stopped functioning. The legal barrier that should have prevented further harm was no longer there. Then came the public fallout. Once the evidence presented by 12 women became widely known, Caleb's online empire collapsed completely. Before that, he had already been struggling financially because of problems surrounding the platform. Now the damage went far beyond money. His image fell apart. Remaining sponsorships disappeared almost overnight. Former supporters turned away. The income stream that had once fueled his lifestyle dried up completely. The mask was gone. What remained was a man with empty bank accounts, a shattered reputation, and a growing public record of alleged aggressive behavior. Against the backdrop of that personal collapse, something unexpected happened. For a short time, Sheila managed to create distance between herself and him. At first, it looked like the opportunity everyone had been hoping for, a chance to finally get away. But Caleb had no intention of letting go so easily. After losing influence over thousands of followers, he tightened his grip on the one person still within reach. Almost immediately, he changed tactics. He launched a targeted campaign against Sheila's reputation online. Using what remained of his loyal fan base, he encouraged a wave of harassment directed at her. Accusations flooded social media. People labeled her greedy. They called her disloyal. Meanwhile, Caleb publicly portrayed himself as the real victim, shifting responsibility for his failures onto her. And this is where one of the most effective manipulation tactics begins to appear. Just a few days before recording this video, I spoke with a crisis psychology specialist who pointed out something important. The most powerful weapon in relationships built on control isn't constant hostility. It's the sudden reversal. After public attacks and humiliation, the aggressor abruptly changes course. Private messages replace public criticism. Apologies replace accusations. Promises replace threats. He begs for forgiveness. He claims everything happened because of stress, financial pressure, and the collapse of his business. He promises to change. He promises it will never happen again. And that strategy can be incredibly effective against someone who has already been isolated from family, support systems, and personal independence. Before long, Caleb got exactly what he wanted. Sheila forgave him, and she returned. She crossed the threshold of their shared apartment once again, but by then, the balance of power inside that home had changed completely. Before the public scandal, Caleb had still maintained at least a small performance of normal life. He needed the image. He needed the social media posts. He needed followers to believe he was the perfect partner. Now that incentive was gone. There was no longer any reason for him to keep up the act. He didn't need to play the role of the ideal boyfriend anymore. From that moment forward, the isolation became nearly absolute. Every connection to the outside world was cut off. No online communication. No meaningful contact with friends or family. Sheila found herself trapped inside an apartment with a man whose anger over the collapse of his life had reached a breaking point. All of the frustration from his personal failures had become focused on the one person still within reach. Only a few hours remained before the events of October 8th. October 8th, 2023. Fort Worth, Texas. We're now returning to the night where this investigation began. But this time, we're not relying on the emotional story told by the man on the emergency call. Instead, we're following the medical evidence. Because it was inside the medical examiner's office that the carefully constructed story about a family dog suddenly fell apart. The first major blow to that explanation came from toxicology results. Laboratory testing revealed an extremely high concentration of powerful sedative medications in Sheila's system. And let's be honest for a second. Family pets do not somehow administer tranquilizers before an incident occurs. That single fact immediately challenged the idea that this was a tragic accident. Investigators now had a very different picture. The evidence suggested that Sheila had been heavily sedated beforehand, leaving her unable to effectively respond, call for help, or leave the apartment. It pointed to planning rather than spontaneity. Then medical specialists moved on to examine the physical injuries. Imaging studies revealed extensive trauma, including multiple rib fractures and deep puncture wounds. The force involved was so significant that examiners documented a specific injury, commonly known in medicine as cauliflower ear. This type of cartilage damage is most often associated with professional combat athletes after repeated heavy impacts to the side of the head. When you look at those findings, one question immediately comes to mind. How did anyone expect injuries like these to be attributed solely to a dog? Experts reconstructed what they believed had actually happened. The evidence did not support a brief argument or a sudden outburst. Instead, the condition of the body suggested a prolonged period of aggression directed at someone who had already been rendered largely defenseless by medication. And when it was over, when Sheila was no longer breathing, Investigators found no indication of a frantic attempt to save her. According to the prosecution's theory, Caleb had time. Time to collect himself. Time to look around the apartment. Time to begin shaping a different story. Investigators later concluded that items inside the residence had been deliberately arranged to support the version of events he intended to tell. The same carefully staged scene that Detective Tracy Dixon would eventually recognize. Only after he was satisfied that everything appeared believable did he pick up the phone and contact emergency services. On that call, he delivered a dramatic performance filled with panic and tears. But investigators would later argue that another decision made that night revealed just how far he was willing to go. To strengthen his story, he blamed his own dog, Soldier. He understood exactly what that accusation would trigger. A dog officially identified as responsible for a fatal incident would almost certainly be taken into custody and euthanized under standard procedures. That meant one very important thing. The animal would never be available for further examination that might challenge his version of events. According to investigators, every living being inside that apartment had become expendable if it helped protect his freedom. Immediately after his arrest in October 2023, while forensic specialists were only beginning to analyze the medical findings, Caleb did something that still feels unsettling to read about. Sheila's family created a GoFundMe page to help cover funeral expenses. And among the people who donated, one name stood out. He contributed $200 and left a short public message. "I love you." At that point, you almost have to stop and ask yourself how this case could become any more disturbing. According to prosecutors, a man responsible for the events that ended Sheila's life had already blamed his own dog to protect himself. And now, he was attempting to present himself as the grieving boyfriend with a $200 donation and a carefully chosen comment. Investigators would later view it as one final attempt to shape public perception and preserve the image he had spent years creating. But that performance finally came to an end in April 2026 inside a Tarrant County courtroom. And this is where an important legal detail reveals how the system sometimes operates in complex cases. Prosecutors did not pursue the most direct homicide charge available. Why? Because of the extraordinary severity of the injuries involved. The documented trauma was so extensive, and the concentration of sedative medication was so significant that the medical examiner could not identify a single, definitive cause of death for the court. A skilled defense team could have focused on that uncertainty and attempted to create reasonable doubt before a jury. So prosecutors chose a different strategy. Rather than risk losing the case, they pursued a first-degree aggravated assault charge, supported by the strongest available evidence. The trial itself became a complete dismantling of the identity Caleb had spent years building. One after another, surviving women took the witness stand. Among them were Carrie, Darian, and Ashley. Under oath, they described experiences they had previously been too afraid to discuss publicly. Court records included testimony describing years of psychological control, repeated intimidation, and other deeply troubling allegations. This time, glowing character references and support from wealthy associates made no difference. The court weighed the evidence, the testimony, and the documented history together. For the crime against Sheila, Caleb was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Then the justice system addressed an earlier failure. An additional 20 years were added for violating the probation terms connected to Darian's case. And finally, another 15 years were imposed for a proven armed assault case involving Ashley in Dallas County. 75 years behind bars. The online empire of Cash Cartier disappeared almost overnight. The man who spent years selling people a carefully crafted illusion of success while believing he could avoid consequences forever ended up exactly where he never imagined he would be. No more luxury cars, no more live streams, no more carefully managed image, and no more opportunities to create new victims.
Support us by liking and subscribing. Share your theories in the comments. Until next time, stay vigilant.